I'm going to speak today about the relationship between Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Judith Butler, and in an attempt to, reflect on the thoughts of Kant, who was born in Königsberg in the 18th century, and the relationship between this approach of philosophy and philosophy we've been familiarizing ourselves with the past 50 or 80 years, the branch of philosophy that has generated much interest in historicist leanings, what we call Judith Butler's Post-Modernism, Post-Structuralism. So that's just, the topic of the conversation. And in my attempt to talk about Kant and juxtapose him with someone like Judith Butler, it's only to first acknowledge that Butler is very much explicitly making it known that her approach is different. Judith Butler does not believe in the way of philosophy that moral philosophers like Kant and Christine Gorsgaard and many Kantian scholars, what we call the constructionist Kantian scholars, their methods of analysis and their point of departure into the normative concerns are just different than something like Butler. Butler is coming from a tradition that this hermeneutic image of Jacques Derrida, Strauss, Paul Levi-Strauss, and the structuralist work of language of Saussure. And it's interesting, there are certain things in structuralism that what we call from Levi-Strauss, that there are certainly true things in structuralism, like the effect of Wittgenstein in the era of Oxford, that this notion that you can agree with Descartes that you're a subject and that words refer to names of things. Wittgenstein would say words have meaning through their relationship with other words, and the language and meaning demands a texture. It's a network, and you can't have an isolated conception of meaning in a single moment, and meaning demands a texture and a network, and language is something that transcends us in some sense. It's something that is independent of us. And someone like Butler is borrowing the epistemic and conceptual framework of people like Derrida and Lacan, and really philosophers who one might be tempted to reduce their core thesis on a historicist leaning, that the meaning of words, good, right, wrong, aren't really isolated apart outside the discourses we practice, that there's no conception of a meaning or referent of a word to the external world that transcends the historical epoch. People like what we call historicism, one thesis, the Hegelian, is less weaker than the historicist thesis of someone like Butler. Butler would say that the self only finds meaning and precedent and valorizes itself. It becomes sanctified in the domain of norms, and that norms are prior to the self. We don't have full transparency. We don't know ourselves fully, and we are transcended by norms, language. We are mediated by whole sort of structures that transcends us. And of course, this is, my problem with that view is that this is sort of a truism, that of course we are transcended by all sorts of systems, and we're prepared to accept a little bit of what Freud said, that we have unconscious motives, and that this, what Paul Ricoeur calls the hermeneutics of suspicions, that people like Marx and Nietzsche really compromise the stature of human beings, that we are not fully autonomous, rational, reflective beings, as the novels of Don Quixote show, that we are a system that is subject to myriad of influences that we ourselves have not chosen. And their whole insight, people like Butler, Derrida, Lacan, their conceptual emphasis and their hermeneutics is that we are not the authors of the purposes we choose to pursue. And hence, by necessity, their logic is that moral claims about the external world, that truth, the reference of the word good, obligations, normativity itself can't be of our own choosing, that the terms we borrow are the discourse we use, the categories we apply, are just things that we have borrowed. They're the impediments to morality that prevail in any century, in any life, any decade. According to Butler, seem to like destabilize the authenticity or legitimacy of norms. And in Kant's defense, I think her view is Butler's view is kind of, I think, contradictory, because a philosopher once said, anyone who says there's no truth, then all truth is relative, is asking you not to believe them. Because of course Butler, in her book 2005, Giving an Account of Oneself, famously and explicitly says that we must resist the encroachment and norms of violence, and we should embrace the philosophy of humility and care. But of course, care and humility and resistance to violence themselves are universal features of the world. And when Butler criticizes this Kantian notion of obligations and realism and normative realism, the resources that what Butler uses are themselves universal tools she's borrowing. And so in the dialogue between Kant and Butler, it's worth emphasizing that for Butler, the notion of the emphasis of postmodernism is really a distrust with universalized narratives. People like Kant that offer this realism view about the normative world, that we have rationality endows us with certain obligations, we have duties, morality is something we can apprehend, it's not just honorific. And the problem with Butler's view is that any appeal to what we should do, resist norms, embrace them, humility, nonviolence itself, must be appealing and borrowing the language of normativity, because the fact of the matter is that one of the most prevailing and powerful effects of Kant has been to emphasize that morality is a feature of the world, that norms aren't really we create or construct, they're inherent to the fabric of reality. And if I light someone on fire, their jacket, or steal from them, the first thing they're going to be tempted to say, why did you do that? Why are you hurting me? And you put your hand on a stove, you're in pain. You're not going to think about whether the norms of avoiding pain is something you borrowed from the Scottish Enlightenment or the British New Platonists. The first thing that happens when you're in pain is that you're going to say, I want to get out of pain, and anybody who imposes pain on me is a villain. Now that is like a direct refutation of the Butlerian notion and the Jacques Derrida and Jacques Lacan, this notion that the reference of good and bad is just like historical and reconstructed. I mean, we can't afford to live by that worldview, because in that sense, like the self doesn't know itself, it's opaque, and agency is compromised, and the notions of good and evil, justice, fairness, equality, pluralism, inclusivity, they're just how apes like us tend to work with words. When Butler says that truth, she says that every suicide, every act of suicide, is an indictment of the social life. And then she mentions Max Weber, and of course Weber focused on meaningful action, and for him the fundamental unit of analysis for Max Weber was always the individual actor. And Weber said that ideas developed and promoted by self-interested leaders, religious entrepreneurs, elites attempting to justify their own privileges, have an independent influence on social action. But for Durkheim, culture is constituted by collective representations, and hence collective solidarity. These are not ideas in the Weberian sense. They are the vehicles of a fundamentally shared symbol group. Symbols do not reflect our lives; they constitute it. And Butler is basically saying human beings are just historical beings, reflections of their environment, and that is like the Antonio Gramsci famous phrase that we mold the society forms us into clay. And I mean, this whole philosophy that you're just historical beings and malleable cogs in a very constrained machine, if all of that is true, then there's no moral barrier why we should treat everybody with fairness and dignity and equality, and the encroachment of the idea of what Kant called the gemeine Menschenvernunft, that every human being has inherent dignity. And the reason for that isn't because of our particular desires, it's because something that we share with humanity. And I would say that in a world where calling things by the right name has geopolitical consequences, we can't afford to merely locate the force of morality in just language. One of the things that George Orwell said before he died was that how we learn to think about morality by virtue of language and reference and terms, the words and meaning, that's what's going to dictate the fate of the 21st century. And I think we're at a point where relativism and subjectivism is the lifeblood of exonerating and vindicating people from the real burden of their normative life. Human beings are essentially normative agents, and any attempt to give an account of our activity in merely prudential and instrumental terms seems to undercut what's so salient about human life, that we evaluate our reasons for acting. And when Kant says that morality is not empirical, it's not constructed, it's not based on experience, it's based on our capacity, our reine Vernunft, our pure practical reason, that one can sometimes people do overcome egoism and self-interest and care about other people. They put other people ahead of themselves in situations that would be ideal, and that has nothing to do with an agent borrowing the discursive practices of his predecessors. In many cases, the guarantor of our morality, the progress that we've created in civilization, is because of people borrowing discourse to challenge the sectarianism that we've suffered from. And what the world needs now, every domain of inquiry requires that, transcend the accidents of merely contingent history, transcend the fact that people used to live in psychological, conceptual, linguistic isolation with one another for centuries. The barbarians and the Syrian, they were completely isolated within epistemic frameworks and geographically isolated, and hence we have to outgrow our provincialism, this notion that morality is just it's almost like taste, as Hume would have said. This, like when we look at the world, all we see are just patterns of events, as Hume would have said. This is positivism, that things are just happening, and there's no norms, there's no duty, there's no obligation, there's no justice. Just how apes like us learn to work with words, that there's no corner of the universe that can announce things being good or bad, apart from us, from our language, from our stories. And I think that's a unsustainable way to create a civilization based on that worldview, because I hate to quote Carl Schmitt, but politics is defined by friend and enemy, and it's an ontological distinction between good and evil. And whether Butler's epistemic thesis is true or not, nevertheless we have to find a way to create a viable global civilization where human beings can thrive. And there's no way to chart a course for a future in which people's sacrifices, their acts of overcoming egoism and generosity, is just a term they borrow from norms. Well, my simple challenge, one, to Butler is that, by embracing humility and nonviolence, Butler itself is appealing to the value of inclusivity and pluralism, which I grant is a good thing. And secondly, in norms, there's often contradictory values. In any prevailing domain of discourse, in any norm, there are those who have tension with other groups. And so which norms? Is norms a unified species, or is it partitioned? And I think what is at all confusing about Derrida and Butler does serve this notion that there's nothing outside the text, there's nothing outside language. And I think even if that were true, it's a truism, because this is the very confines of human life, and this our facticity. We're not perfect, we don't have complete knowledge of an external world. You're phenomenal beings, and the Kantian thesis is that there's always potentially a gap between what I have to do and what I want to do, and that normativity means that irrespective of my personal eccentricity, desires, I have an obligation to, at times, not always, prioritize compassion, forgiveness, empathy. And I think if you're in a point where people can afford to get away with these things, but nevertheless, the idea of obligations to our peers, interpersonal obligations, is only comes into light when we do acknowledge that we have reflective capacities, that we can choose ends, we can evaluate our reasons for acting, and anyways, thank you.